I mean, we've covered a few different points. We kind of started with a discussion about the idea of, whether, I guess, the trade-offs. We've talked about how if you reduce operational carbon, there may be trade-offs in increased embodied carbon, but perhaps, this idea that of building lightweight structures that don't last as long with, say, embodied carbon, but is there a trade-off on the operational side? So kind of this, just acknowledging this need to always keep the sort of big picture in mind. We've talked about the challenges around measurement and made the point that actually measurement is a bit of a misleading term. You're only ever modelling. You're not really measuring. You're kind of guessing, which makes it very hard to compare one with another. So there's obviously lots of kind of challenges coming out. There was another point about transport emissions and how often when you get into it, people are measuring transport emissions from a warehouse to the site, when actually there'll be a lot of transport emissions before the product arrives at the warehouse. So there's lots of issues been raised rather than any solutions being come to, I would say. And I guess final point just that often clients aren't very informed about the issue. So even where we've got a contractor representative on the table, they may be wanting to drive this, but if the client isn't informed and isn't interested, then there's not much traction for that. Is that a fair point? Have I missed anything?
Okay, thanks, Ian. Take it back, just scribble. It's fine.
We haven't finished our discussion, which hopefully probably haven't either. We went through a number of issues, including carbon factors were debated, the time element was seen as an important part of the calculation as well. We talked about the opportunity to use prefabrication rather than the normal or more traditional method of construction, and the impact that would have, and we generally agree that was probably going to have a positive impact, but we did have to look at individual cases and individual materials to see where the best results would come from that. We drove into that a little bit further and said, is it realistic to actually be able to specify materials and manufacturers and perhaps even factories where the materials would come from? And we didn't get to the end of that discussion, but we felt that commercial pressures to go out to the market to tender meant that there was limited opportunity to be able to be so specific about where your products would be coming from and who would be providing them. We talked about the life cycle of the building and what that should be. We had the benefit of a pretty large developer biologist on our table who have done some work on that and are thinking that 30 years was far more realistic than 60 years traditionally talked about. And then we were just trying to get into the real nuts of the subject by saying we need to talk about this in terms of the commercial benefits if we're actually going to be able to achieve anything. And we didn't really get to the point where we said, how are we going to do that? And that's what we might do now in the next 5 minutes, is to say, how do we put a money tag on front of this and therefore do something about it? I think that's what we're trying.
Right, thanks very much. Really interesting point, especially about the commercial, I think, on this table as well. Gary's got the choice.
Yeah, we get 2 pages of notes.
Just 3.
We touched on cost-benefit analysis, where one of the key drivers for people who are specifying buildings and they're going to incorporate carbon into their cost analysis when they're actually determining what they're going to be constructing. There's a point raised about is there a balance between direct emissions and indirect carbon emissions. At what point we got noticed from Howard's slides is the difference between the operational emissions and the embedded emissions, and what that does for us all. I get a chance to ask Howard about that one later on. We kept coming up against the time curve. We thought it was a great idea, but then there was some discussions about the service life to combine some of those curves between the building services and the structural side of things. And that led us on to the life cycle period again, looking at different periods over the whole life cycle of the building, bringing in these direct and indirect components. And then over that period, for 60 years, 100 years, the building is refurbished every 10 years, for instance. So the embodied carbon footprint changes over that 100 years 10 times. We then went on to talk about, there are some things, but where will the embodied carbon research lead us? Was a question raised one of these into potentially regulation, as we see with operational carbon. Is there a tax opportunity for the government to put some levies against us? What would that look like when you join the two together as a financial impact to the organisation?
Brilliant, thanks very much. Final term?
Okay, we talked about good practice quite a bit in various areas around embodied carbon. So one of the first things we looked at was the timber industry, in which the drivers seem to be working for utilising the carbon benefits of timber construction. So that's basically the element of sequestration, as well as the comparison with things like steel and concrete. And one of the interesting drivers there was it helped local authorities as clients offset their 10% requirement to use renewables, is that it? Yeah, right, under boroughs. So basically there's that, that's a driver. We moved on to looking at the reuse market generally, because obviously if you reuse things, then you've got an even better carbon benefit than recycling, which can sometimes be downcycling. And the kind of thing that's got a lot of discussion about was looking at buildings as a chassis. Basically, there's a lot of buildings, it was discussed, which are now being stripped to the basics, but basically the concrete structure is intact, and everything else is being replaced, thus making a massive saving in embodied carbon. So that's happening. Whatever's driving it's happening anyway. We finally looked at two other things. One which is the whole idea of modular construction, which comes right down to modular building services or modular fabric components. It was kind of accepted that helps with embodied carbon because you've got standardization and economies of scale. And we felt building services were a challenge, but there was an example of lighting in which one company, I think it's Philips, is making lighting fixtures which have no soldering or glue, so that basically it can easily be constructed. So that's happening. At the other end of the extreme, some mechanical services kit is very challenging for many reasons in terms of how it's made and how complex and how unique each bit is. So I think we mocked up various bits of good practice, and hopefully that will move us forward.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. I mean, I guess from our point of view, for me, we understand operational carbon stores, we understand energy we can meter, we get charged for it, we know exactly where we are, but embodied carbon is still a bit of a question mark. We can put boundaries around it to try and control it in terms of understanding the impact in the business, be it hopefully not from taxes, but in terms of what it means to us and how we can control it and reduce it. That's part of the journey, and I thank you all really for today in terms of being part of that journey with us. So I'll hand you over to Janet to talk.
This is really raising more questions than we asked. But what we're trying to do from this event is relate all the notes that we've got and maybe try and classify them in terms of questions and potential answers and those answers and best practice. And certainly circulate what we might come back to. But I think very much thanks to you coming. If you are interested in keeping up with the research, and obviously Stephen and Mike at a very early stage, and Harry was just about to complete his research. If you want to catch up with any of those results that we highlighted, please do actually share information with everybody welcome on that. But I think very much, if you have any other queries and want to keep the conversation going, do get back to us and we'll try and carry on the conversation. If you are interested in any way, you can get involved in TSBE activities, do talk to me. We have a conference once a year, we have other events like this. If you're interested in any of the expertise we might have at the university between point and then we can see if there's some way to address that in the institution next to or just do contact. But I think today, finally, I have a bunch of thank yous because thank you very much for everybody for taking the time to come. Your discussion has really driven some right today. I really want to thank Stephen, Mike, and Harold, who really have driven this event, conceptualised having this event, and given us an organisation and structure. I think that's really impressive, and that they're actively studying the fundamentals to talk about a really important topic, clearly easy stuff, I very much want to thank Dave Merrifield from Sainsbury's for getting really involved with the organisation of this event and tradition of making them to all for capturing the information. And finally to Jenny and Emma, who always make these events happen, to sit and think it's not like it was. So thanks very much. But thank you all. I hope you have a safe journey home. Any more conversations to have to keep talking.
So,